The morning of November 5, 1943, broke grey and humid over Simpson Harbour as Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda stood on the observation platform at Vunakanau airfield, watching his fighter pilots scramble to their zeros. The alert sirens had been wailing for 3 minutes now, and already he could see the distant specks approaching from the southeast. American carriers. Again. Rabaul was supposed to be impregnable. Admiral Koga had personally assured the garrison that this fortress, ringed by 367 anti-aircraft guns and defended by 5 airfields, it represented the most heavily fortified position in the South Pacific. The harbour below held 7 heavy cruisers that had arrived from Truk just days earlier. Nearly 200 aircraft sat in hardened revetments across Rabaul's airfields. 80,000 troops manned defensive positions carved into the volcanic rock. This was where Japan would break the American advance, where superior fighting spirit and tactical brilliance would compensate for whatever material advantages the enemy might possess. Genda had flown combat since Pearl Harbor. He had seen his share of American fighters, the clumsy Buffalo, easily shredded, the adequate Wildcat, dangerous in skilled hands but outmatched by the Zero in every measurable way. Even the new Hellcat, impressive but predictable in its tactics. But now, as the formation drew closer and he raised his binoculars, Genda saw something that made his experienced hands grip the railing harder than necessary. Bent wings. Unmistakable bent wings on fighters that seemed larger and more menacing than anything he had encountered before. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans called them Corsairs. Genda had read the intelligence reports, dismissed half of them as the usual American exaggeration. Maximum speed of 446 miles per hour, 650 caliber machine guns, powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. The specifications seemed impossible, the kind of numbers that emerged when frightened pilots overestimated what had attacked them. No carrier fighter could be that fast, that heavily armed, that powerful. The Zero had dominated Pacific skies for nearly 2 years because Japanese designers understood that a fighter needed range and maneuverability above all else. Heavy engines and thick armor were American mistakes, the desperation of engineers who didn't understand aerial combat. But as the first wave of Corsairs dove toward the harbor with a sound like tearing canvas, their distinctive gull wings creating a whistle that made even veteran troops flinch, Genda understood that intelligence reports had not been exaggerating. If anything, they had understated the threat. The Corsairs came in fast. Not the tentative altitude-preserving approach of earlier American fighters, but aggressive slashing attacks that exploited pure speed to overwhelm defenses before they could coordinate responses. Genda watched 3 Zeros rise to meet them, good pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities. They attempted to force the Americans into the turning fight where Japanese maneuverability would decide the outcome. The Corsairs didn't turn. They didn't slow down. They didn't engage on any terms except their own. The lead Corsair simply extended away from the pursuing Zeros, accelerating to speeds that made chasing it suicidal. The Japanese fighters would either have to break off or push their airframes past safe limits in a dive that would likely end with structural failure. The Zeros broke off. The Corsair pilot executed a climbing roll, gained altitude, and dove back into the fight from above with all the energy advantage that superior power and robust construction could provide. A 5-second burst from 650 caliber machine guns turned a Zero into falling debris. By mid-1943, Japanese naval aviation existed in a state of carefully maintained denial about the scope of its problems. The Zero, which had terrorized Allied pilots in 1941 and early 1942, was now hemorrhaging experienced pilots at rates that training programs could not replace. American factories were producing fighters in quantities that seemed impossible, and critically, those fighters were getting better, while Japanese designs stagnated. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been designed around a philosophy that valued range and agility over all other considerations. Empty weight of 3,700 pounds, maximum range of 1,900 miles, rate of climb exceeding 4,000 feet per minute in early models. In a slow-speed turning fight, nothing in 1941 could match it. Pilots who learned to exploit that advantage became aces. The aircraft became legend, but that legend came with trade-offs that seemed acceptable in 1941 and catastrophic by 1943. No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, lightweight construction that could be pierced by rifle-caliber rounds. The Zero's designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had been tasked with creating a long-range carrier fighter that could escort bombers across the vast Pacific. He succeeded brilliantly by removing everything that seemed unnecessary. Protection was unnecessary if your pilots were skilled enough not to get hit. Heavy armament was wasteful when well-placed shots from light machine guns could down enemy fighters. Robust construction sacrificed performance for survivability that proper tactics should make irrelevant. These assumptions worked perfectly until they stopped working. By November 1943, over Rabaul, they had stopped working entirely. The F4U Corsair represented the complete opposite philosophy. Vought aircraft's designers had received specifications from the U.S. Navy in 1938 that called for the fastest, hardest-hitting carrier fighter possible. Speed and firepower would be prioritized. Pilot protection would be mandatory. The aircraft needed to survive combat damage and brutal carrier operations. Weight was a concern, but pilot survival mattered more. The result was an aircraft that shocked even American commanders. Empty weight of 9,200 pounds, nearly 2.5 times heavier than a Zero. But that weight bought survival. Behind the pilot seat sat 3/8 of an inch of steel armor plate, angled to deflect rounds from behind and below. The headrest incorporated additional armor. The windscreen used bullet-resistant glass 1.5 inches thick. Total armor weight approached 150 pounds, mass that Japanese designers would have considered completely unacceptable. The fuel tanks employed sophisticated self-sealing technology, using multiple layers of different materials. Innermost sat synthetic rubber compounds that swelled when exposed to aviation gasoline, automatically plugging bullet holes within seconds. Outside that, untreated fabric, vulcanized rubber, and aluminum outer skins. American pilots could take multiple hits to fuel tanks and still make it home. Zero pilots knew that a single tracer round through an unprotected fuel tank meant imminent fire and death. The R2800 Double Wasp engine was a mechanical monster, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, bore of 5.75 inches, stroke of 6 inches, total displacement of 2,800 cubic inches. Nearly 46 litres of displacement, producing 2,000 horsepower at war emergency power. For comparison, the Nakajima Sakai engine powering most Zeros displaced 27.9 litres and produced roughly 1,130 horsepower. The Corsair's engine alone weighed more than some complete Japanese fighters. That massive engine required a massive propeller to absorb all that power. Hamilton Standard built a 3-bladed propeller, 13 feet 4 inches in diameter, the largest fitted to any fighter at that time. The propeller demanded ground clearance that would have required impossibly long landing gear. Vaught's solution was the distinctive inverted gull wing, raising the fuselage high enough for propeller clearance while keeping landing gear relatively short and strong for carrier operations. The design became the Corsair's most recognizable feature, creating the bent wing silhouette that Japanese spotters learned to fear. The armament told the same story of overwhelming American industrial capacity translated into combat effectiveness. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing. Each gun fired at roughly 800 rounds per minute. 6 guns firing simultaneously delivered 4,800 rounds per minute, a rate of fire that could saw through a Zero's unarmored structure in seconds. Total ammunition capacity of 2,350 rounds provided approximately 30 seconds of sustained fire. 30 seconds seemed brief until one calculated what 6 heavy machine guns could accomplish in that time. Japanese fighters typically carried 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. The 7.7mm rounds, adequate against early war Allied aircraft, proved completely ineffective against the Corsair's armor and robust construction. The 20mm cannon delivered more hitting power, but Japanese pilots found that unless they achieved hits on critical unarmored components, the Corsair absorbed the punishment and kept fighting. American pilots reported returning to base with dozens of hits, holes you could put your fist through, and aircraft that still flew. The tactical implications of this design philosophy differential became catastrophic for Japanese aviation. American doctrine evolved to exploit the Corsair's advantages while avoiding situations where the Zero's agility could compensate. Boom and zoom attacks became standard. Dive from altitude using superior speed. Deliver a burst from 650 caliber guns. Use superior power and structural strength to climb away before a turning fight could develop. If the first pass didn't kill the target, climb back up and try again. The Zero pilot, lacking speed to pursue and lacking climb rate to follow vertically, could only evade and hope the Corsair pilot made a mistake. But Corsair pilots were well trained and equipped with aircraft that forgave mistakes Japanese fighters punished with death. An American pilot who misjudged an attack could simply dive away, accelerating to speeds where Japanese fighters couldn't follow without risking structural failure. A Japanese pilot who misjudged an evasion had nowhere to go. The Corsair could outrun him, outclimb him, outdive him, and absorb far more damage than he could inflict before his ammunition ran out. Rabaul in late 1943 represented the test case for whether Japanese fighting spirit could overcome American material superiority. The fortress had been built up over nearly 2 years into the most formidable defensive position in the Pacific. 5 airfields with concrete runways and hardened revetments for hundreds of aircraft. Simpson Harbor, a natural deep-water anchorage that could shelter entire fleets. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels carved into volcanic rock for protection from air raids. 367 anti-aircraft guns, ranging from 13mm machine guns to 127mm cannons. A garrison of 80,000 troops. The Japanese High Command believed Rabaul would be where the American advance broke. Every previous attempt to attack the fortress had been costly. 5th Air Force raids from Papua New Guinea paid heavily for modest damage to airfields and shipping. The distance made fighter escort impossible, forcing bombers to attack without protection against swarms of defending Zeros. The Japanese calculated that Rabaul's defenses could absorb whatever the Americans could inflict, while Japanese forces used the base to launch counterattacks against Allied positions in the Solomon Islands. The calculation appeared sound until American strategy shifted. Instead of trying to capture Rabaul through direct assault, Allied planners decided to isolate and neutralize the fortress through sustained air attack. The capture of Bougainville in November 1943 brought Rabaul within range of land-based American fighters for the first time. Marine F4U Corsair squadrons began operating from newly constructed airfields at Torokina. Navy carrier task forces could now strike Rabaul with fighter cover from land bases supplementing their own aircraft. The fortress that had seemed impregnable suddenly faced coordinated attacks it couldn't prevent. Admiral Minachi Koga responded by committing Japan's most precious remaining asset to Rabaul's defense. The carrier air groups from Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Zuiho, representing the last concentrations of experienced carrier pilots remaining after the slaughter at Midway and the grinding attrition in the Solomon Islands campaign, were transferred to land bases around Rabaul. 173 carrier aircraft, 82 Zeros, 45 dive bombers, 40 torpedo bombers. These were not green replacement pilots fresh from abbreviated training courses. These were veterans who had survived months of combat, who understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations, who had killed before and expected to kill again. They arrived at Rabaul expecting to defend from altitude, to exploit the Zero's climb rate and maneuverability, to use swarm tactics against lumbering American bombers. What they encountered instead was the F4U Corsair, operating in numbers and employing tactics that made Japanese advantages irrelevant. The first major engagement occurred on November 2, 1943. 72 B-25 Mitchell bombers, escorted by 80 P-38 Lightning fighters, attacked Simpson Harbor and the surrounding airfields. The Japanese launched over 100 aircraft to meet them, confident that superior numbers and home field advantage would yield another costly day for American air power. The battle developed over the harbour and nearby airfields, dozens of aircraft swirling in combat at altitudes ranging from wavetop to 20,000 feet. Japanese pilots scored kills. 9 B-25s went down, 10 P-38s destroyed. American gunners and fighters claimed over 100 Japanese aircraft shot down, a wildly optimistic overclaim typical of confused aerial combat where multiple attackers engaged the same targets. Actual Japanese losses were closer to 20 aircraft, still significant but not catastrophic. But the raid succeeded in its primary objective. Multiple cruisers in Simpson Harbor took damage, airfield facilities burned, and critically, American forces demonstrated they could strike Rabaul in strength and survive the experience. The fortress was no longer untouchable. 3 days later, on November 5th, the real shock came when carrier task forces struck Rabaul with over 90 aircraft, including F4U Corsairs, from marine land-based squadrons providing top cover. This was the raid Genda watched develop from Guadalcanal. The Corsairs entered combat not as tentative newcomers, but as an overwhelming force that simply ignored tactical situations where Japanese fighters held advantage and exploited every condition where American material superiority could dominate. Genda's pilots were good. Veterans of months of combat, they understood how to maximize the Zero's agility and rate of climb. They attempted to force Corsairs into turning engagements at low altitude, where Japanese maneuverability advantages were most pronounced. The Corsairs refused. American pilots had been briefed extensively on the Zero's capabilities and trained specifically in tactics that neutralized those advantages. A Corsair would never follow a Zero into a low-speed turning fight, never slow down enough for Japanese agility to matter, never commit to an engagement where the outcome depended on pilot skill rather than aircraft performance. Instead, Corsair pilots used their overwhelming power and speed advantages to control every aspect of engagement terms. They attacked from above, they maintained high speed, they delivered devastating bursts from 650 caliber guns and climbed away before Japanese fighters could close the distance. When Japanese pilots tried to pursue, the Corsairs simply accelerated to speeds the Zeros couldn't match without risking structural failure. When Japanese pilots tried to climb after them, the massive R-2800 engines pulled Corsairs vertical at rates the lighter Zeros couldn't sustain. When Japanese pilots managed to achieve firing position, their 7.7mm machine guns rattled harmlessly off Corsair armor, while 20mm cannon rounds, unless perfectly placed, only wounded aircraft that could absorb tremendous punishment. The engagement's outcome told a brutal story. American fighters claimed 20 to 30 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Japanese pilots claimed similar numbers of American losses, but when forces returned to base and damaged aircraft were assessed, the asymmetry became undeniable. Japanese losses exceeded 30 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. American losses totaled 11 aircraft, most to anti-aircraft fire rather than air-to-air combat. More devastating than the raw numbers was what those losses represented. The American aircraft were replaceable. Factories in the United States were producing Corsairs at a rate exceeding 400 per month by late 1943. Pilot training pipelines delivered hundreds of newly qualified aviators monthly, young men with over 300 hours of flight training and extensive gunnery practice. Every American loss would be made good within weeks. The Japanese aircraft were not replaceable at anything approaching adequate rates. Mitsubishi and Nakajima's production facilities, operating at maximum capacity and increasingly targeted by Allied bombing raids, delivered roughly 120 fighters monthly to all theaters. Pilot training had been compressed to barely 100 hours by late 1943, with fuel shortages forcing even that reduced schedule to be cut further. Veterans lost over Rabaul couldn't be replaced. Skills acquired through years of peacetime training and months of combat experience couldn't be recreated in abbreviated courses taught by instructors who themselves lacked combat experience. Admiral Koga committed more carrier air groups. Veteran pilots continued arriving at Rabaul throughout November and December 1943, feeding into what Japanese aviators grimly termed the Bismarck sinkhole. The seemingly hopeless situation where experienced carrier pilots were being systematically destroyed by an enemy whose material advantages made skill increasingly irrelevant. Every raid cost the Japanese pilots and aircraft they couldn't afford to lose. Every raid demonstrated that Rabaul's vaunted defenses couldn't stop the attacks or inflict prohibitive losses on attackers. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots proved as devastating as the material losses. Veterans who had dominated Pacific skies in 1941 and early 1942 now flew knowing they were outmatched, knowing that American fighters were faster, more powerful, better protected, knowing that tactical skill and fighting spirit couldn't compensate for aircraft that absorbed multiple hits and kept fighting while a PT and single burst could obliterate a zero, knowing that they were flying essentially unprotected aircraft into combat against enemies who sat behind armor plate thick enough to stop rifle rounds. Only the first pilot quote about, "We are not fighting against pilots anymore. We are fighting against machines we cannot damage with our weapons," and later analyzed by Allied intelligence, revealed the erosion of morale that material disadvantage created. A Zero pilot from the 321st Air Group wrote in December 1943, "We achieved a good attacking position against the American fighters multiple times. I fired and observed hits on the fuselage and wings. The enemy aircraft did not burn. It did not fall. It simply rolled away and accelerated to speeds we cannot match. I expended all my ammunition and watched him fly away as though nothing had happened. We are not fighting against pilots anymore. We are fighting against machines we cannot damage with our weapons." Another pilot, whose identity was lost when his carrier group was effectively destroyed in January 1944, left notes recovered after the war that described the tactical impossibility Japanese fighters faced. "The American fighter called Corsair controls all terms of engagement. If we climb, it climbs faster. If we run, it catches us. If we turn, it does not follow but climbs away and attacks again from a position of advantage. Our only victories come when American pilots make severe mistakes, and they make fewer mistakes than our pilots because their training is longer and their aircraft forgive errors that kill us." The numbers supported these observations. By the end of January 1944, Japanese aviation strength at Rabaul had collapsed. The carrier air groups that arrived in November with 173 aircraft had lost 50% of their fighters, 85% of their dive bombers, and 90% of their torpedo bombers. Of the pilots who arrived, the majority were dead, wounded, or missing. The few survivors were withdrawn to truck, their combat effectiveness destroyed even when they survived physically. Total Japanese aircraft losses from November 1943 through February 1944, when organized Japanese air resistance at Rabaul effectively ended, exceeded 350 aircraft. Allied losses in the same period totaled 136 aircraft, approximately a 3-to-1 kill ratio that becomes even more lopsided when accounting for the fact that many American losses were to anti-aircraft fire rather than air-to-air combat. In pure fighter versus fighter engagements, the Corsair achieved kill ratios approaching 12-to-1 against Zeros. That 12-to-1 ratio represented something more significant than a single superior aircraft design. It represented the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare and industrial production. Japan had built an air force around the assumption that skilled pilots flying nimble, long-range fighters could overcome numerical and material disadvantages through superior tactics and fighting spirit. America built an air force around the assumption that overwhelming industrial capacity, producing robust, powerful aircraft flown by adequately trained pilots, would win through attrition and material superiority. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical intelligence that Japanese engineers managed to gather about the Corsair came primarily through combat observations from this sentence, through the production versions suffered from quality control. issues that reduced effectiveness and reliability, and the occasional recovery of wreckage from aircraft that crashed in Japanese-controlled territory. Unlike the captured Hellcat that arrived relatively intact at Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, no complete F4U fell into Japanese hands during the critical months of combat over Rabaul. What intelligence did exist came from fragments, from photographs taken during combat, from the testimony of pilots who survived encounters, and from the increasingly desperate after-action reports that painted a picture of an aircraft that seemed to violate everything Japanese aviation doctrine considered possible. The analysis that emerged from these incomplete sources revealed an aircraft that embodied principles Japanese designers had systematically rejected. The Corsair's Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp engine produced approximately 71 horsepower per litre of displacement at war emergency power. Japanese engineers examining the figures initially assumed errors in calculation or exaggeration by combat pilots. The Nakajima Sakai engine in the Zero produced approximately 40 horsepower per litre. The differential seemed impossible without some catastrophic compromise in reliability or engine life. But American engines didn't fail at rates Japanese doctrine predicted. Corsairs returned from combat with hundreds of hours on their engines, missions flown in tropical heat and humidity that should have destroyed less robust power plants. The massive forged crankshaft, the precision-machined connecting rods, the sophisticated cooling systems, all pointed toward manufacturing capabilities and quality control processes that Japanese industry couldn't replicate even when they understood the principles involved. The supercharger system particularly frustrated Japanese analysis. The R2800 employed a two-speed, two-stage supercharger that maintained high manifold pressure across a wide altitude range. This wasn't revolutionary technology. Japanese engineers understood the principles. But implementing those principles required precision machinery and manufacturing tolerances that Japanese factories, increasingly bombed and starved of skilled workers, simply couldn't achieve consistently. Even when Japanese engineers designed improved superchargers, the production versions suffered from quality control issues that reduced effectiveness and reliability. The Corsair's structural design represented another philosophical divide. Japanese engineers had become masters at creating lightweight structures through careful material selection and elegant load distribution. The Zero's wing structure used thin aluminum skins carefully formed and assembled with minimal internal framing. Every gram of unnecessary weight was eliminated. The result was an aircraft that flew beautifully in its design envelope, but suffered catastrophic structural failures when pushed beyond design limits or when damaged by enemy fire. The Corsair's wings were built around a massive center section that formed a single continuous structure passing through the fuselage. This design created incredible strength and provided substantial protection for the pilot and fuel tanks. The wing could absorb combat damage that would have caused a Zero's wing to fail completely and still maintain structural integrity. Engineers calculated that a Corsair could probably lose substantial portions of its outer wing panels and still fly home. Zeros regularly suffered wing failures from high-speed maneuvers or combat damage, failures that killed pilots instantly. Weight distribution revealed the depth of the design philosophy gap. The Corsair's empty weight of 9,200 pounds compared to the Zero's 3,700 pounds suggested massive inefficiency from a Japanese perspective. But breaking down where that weight went told a different story. Armor plating, 150 pounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks, approximately 200 pounds for the sealing mechanisms. Robust engine, 2,360 pounds versus the Sakai's 1,100 pounds. Strengthened airframe and landing gear designed to survive. Carrier operations, another several hundred pounds. Every pound of that additional weight served a purpose. American designers had calculated that bringing pilots home alive mattered more than squeezing out a few more knots of speed or degrees of turn radius. The statistics proved them correct. By January 1944, Marine Corsair squadrons operating from Bougainville were losing approximately one aircraft for every 12 Japanese fighters claimed destroyed. The actual verified kill ratio was closer to 1 Corsair lost for every 6 Japanese aircraft destroyed, but even accounting for overclaiming on both sides, the asymmetry was staggering. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Corsairs provided testimony that Allied intelligence intercepted and decoded through signals intelligence. These reports, sanitized versions of which eventually reached Japanese high command, painted a picture of an enemy that had solved problems Japanese aviation still struggled with. One report from late December 1943 described an engagement where Zero pilots made multiple passes on a damaged Corsair, observing hits from both 7.7mm and 20mm weapons. The report noted, enemy aircraft showed visible damage to fuselage and wings. Smoke emanated from engine area. We believed the aircraft was fatally damaged and pursued to confirm the kill. The enemy pilot did not attempt evasive maneuvers, suggesting he could not, but the aircraft continued flying. It did not lose altitude. It maintained course toward friendly territory. We pursued to fuel limits and were forced to break off. The enemy aircraft was last observed still flying, still maintaining altitude, still heading toward safety. We claimed a probable kill, but later reconnaissance suggested the aircraft may have reached its base. This pattern repeated across hundreds of engagements. Corsairs absorbed damage that should have been fatal and kept flying. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic fires that killed so many Zero pilots. The armor plate stopped rounds that would have wounded or killed American pilots. The robust construction meant that even severely damaged Corsairs could often make it back to base, where maintenance crews could repair them and return them to service. Zeros that took equivalent damage generally didn't return at all. The tactical doctrine that emerged from these material realities transformed aerial combat in the Pacific. American fighter pilots, once forced to fight defensively against nimble Zeros, now dictated engagement terms completely. The thatch weave, developed earlier in the war to allow Wildcats to survive against Zeros through mutual support, was refined for Corsairs into an offensive tactic. 2 Corsairs working together could cover each other while maintaining high speed, attacking at will and breaking off whenever Japanese fighters achieved threatening positions. Boom and zoom attacks became the standard approach. Corsairs patrolling at 15 to 20,000 feet would dive on Japanese formations below, accelerating to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. At that velocity, the Corsairs' controls remained effective, while Zero pilots pushing their aircraft past 350 miles per hour risked structural failure or found their controls becoming mushy and unresponsive. The Americans would make a single high-speed pass, deliver devastating bursts from 650 caliber guns, then use their superior power to climb back to altitude before a turning fight could develop. Japanese fighter leaders understood they were being hunted using tactics they couldn't effectively counter. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who led fighter units through the Rabaul campaign until his death in January 1944, wrote in his private journal about the psychological impact of facing an enemy who held every material advantage. We teach our pilots that spirit and skill will overcome mere machinery. We tell them that a well-flown Zero can defeat any American fighter. These are comfortable lies that officers tell young men before sending them to die. The truth is that American fighters are better machines flown by adequately trained pilots who don't need to be brilliant because their aircraft compensate for ordinary skill. Nakajima continued, "Our pilots must be perfect. A single mistake means death because our aircraft cannot protect us. American pilots can make mistakes and survive because their aircraft absorbs punishment. We shoot them repeatedly, and they fly away. They shoot us once and we burn. This is not a war we can win through superior spirit. This is a war of industrial production, and we are being buried under enemy manufacturing capacity." The Rabaul campaign's climax came in the first weeks of January 1944, when Admiral Koga made one final attempt to reinforce the base with additional carrier aircraft and pilots. The logic seemed sound. If enough fighters could be concentrated at Rabaul, if enough anti-aircraft guns could be brought to bear, if enough experienced pilots could be committed, surely the American advance could be stopped, or at least made so costly that Allied planners would reconsider their strategy. The reinforcements arrived in early January, fresh squadrons of Zeros, newly trained pilots mixed with the few remaining veterans. Japanese strength at Rabaul briefly peaked above 150 fighters. For a few days, Japanese commanders believed they might yet turn the tide. The Americans came anyway. Raids in January intensified. Marine and Navy F4U squadrons from Bougainville, supplemented by F6F Hellcats and P-38 Lightnings from Army Air Forces squadrons, struck Rabaul's airfields and harbour facilities daily. The Japanese scrambled everything available to meet each raid. Massive dogfights developed over Simpson Harbour and the surrounding airfields, sometimes involving over 100 aircraft from both sides swirling in combat at altitudes from sea level to 25,000 feet. The January battles were not one-sided massacres. Japanese pilots scored kills. On January 3, 1944, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, the famous Marine Corps ace commanding VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, was shot down after destroying his 26th and 27th enemy aircraft. Boyington and his wingmen had been separated from their formation by weather and attacked a large group of Zeros over Rabaul. In the swirling dogfight that followed, Boyington destroyed 2 Zeros before taking hits to his engine. He made a successful water landing but was strafed by Japanese fighters and eventually picked up by a submarine. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner, but individual Japanese successes couldn't change the mathematical reality of attrition warfare. For every Corsair shot down, Japanese forces lost multiple fighters. The kill ratios from January 1944 averaged approximately 8-1 in favor of Allied fighters in verified claims. Even accounting for typical overclaiming by both sides, the actual ratio remained catastrophically lopsided against Japanese aviation. By mid-January, American fighters were claiming over 260 Japanese aircraft destroyed just by Marine Corps fighter squadrons alone, not including physical damage to Rabaul's infrastructure or shipping. The carrier air groups that had arrived in November 1943 with experienced pilots who had accumulated hundreds of combat hours were effectively annihilated by late January 1944. The replacements arriving from training commands had barely 100 hours of flight time total, much of it in trainers rather than combat aircraft. They lacked gunnery training, formation flying experience, and tactical knowledge. They were being fed into combat against American pilots who had 3 times as much training and flew aircraft that were superior in virtually every measurable way. The final large-scale air battle over Rabaul occurred on February 19, 1944. Allied reconnaissance found little shipping remaining in Simpson Harbour and few aircraft visible at the airfields. The raid proceeded anyway, more to maintain pressure than from expectation of finding major targets. Japanese resistance was minimal. Only a dozen fighters rose to challenge the attackers. Allied losses totaled 1 fighter. Japanese losses, even by conservative estimates, exceeded 10 aircraft. 2 days earlier, Admiral Raymond Spruance's carriers had staged a highly successful raid on Truk, destroying numerous Japanese aircraft and ships at what had been considered Japan's impregnable forward base. The combined fleet withdrew most remaining aviation assets from the region. The decision was made to abandon Rabaul as an active airbase. The surviving Japanese aircraft and their pilots were evacuated to bases further north. By late February 1944, Rabaul's airfields stood essentially empty. The fortress that was supposed to break the American advance had been neutralized without the Allies needing to capture it. The strategy of isolation and air attack had worked. Rabaul's garrison of over 69,000 troops would remain cut off for the rest of the war. The fortress left to wither on the vine as Allied forces bypassed it and continued advancing toward Japan. The airfields that once housed hundreds of Japanese aircraft became targets for training missions, milk runs, where new Allied pilots could gain combat experience against nothing more dangerous than anti-aircraft fire. The cost to Japanese naval aviation proved catastrophic beyond the simple numbers of aircraft destroyed. Total Japanese losses at Rabaul from November 1943 through February 1944 exceeded 360 aircraft. But more devastating than machines lost were the pilots. Most of Japan's experienced carrier pilots had been fed into the Rabaul meat grinder and destroyed. The veteran aviators who had trained for years in peacetime, who had learned their craft through extensive practice, who had accumulated combat experience over months of operations, were gone. Killed over Rabaul or wounded so severely they could never return to combat. The remaining carrier air groups, when the combined fleet finally needed them months later during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, consisted primarily of barely trained replacements who had no business being in combat. American pilots in that engagement would shoot them down in such numbers that the battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The pipeline of skilled aviators that had given Japan its early war successes had been broken at Rabaul, destroyed by an enemy whose material advantages made skill increasingly irrelevant. They had assumed that early victories would buy time to consolidate conquests and build defenses that would make American counteroffensives too costly to sustain. They had assumed that after suffering heavy losses, America would negotiate a settlement, leaving Japan in control of most conquered territories. They had assumed that Japanese fighting spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantages. The Corsair and the industrial might it represented demolished those assumptions. American losses in the Solomons campaign, in the Rabaul neutralization, throughout the island-hopping advance, hadn't slowed the offensive at all. For every American aircraft destroyed, multiple replacements appeared. For every pilot killed, several newly trained aviators arrived from training commands. The production numbers were staggering. Vought and Goodyear were producing over 400 Corsairs monthly by early 1944, and that was just one fighter type among many. Total American aircraft, production for 1944, would exceed 96,000 aircraft of all types. Japan's peak production year was 1944, with approximately 28,000 aircraft total, and that production was already collapsing under Allied bombing campaigns and material shortages. The Americans were building aircraft more than 3 times faster, and American aircraft were individually superior across nearly every performance metric. The industrial war had been lost before the shooting even started. Japan simply hadn't realized it yet. The F4U Corsairs' success over Rabaul forced Japanese military planners to confront fundamental questions they had been avoiding. What happened when an enemy could absorb casualties and replace losses faster than you could inflict them? What happened when that enemy's individual weapons platforms were superior to yours? What happened when your best pilots flying your best tactics couldn't achieve favorable exchange ratios? The answers to those questions were playing out in real time over Rabaul and across the Pacific. You lost. Slowly, expensively, but inevitably. Senior Japanese officers began contemplating options that had been unthinkable earlier in the war. Some advocated for immediate negotiated peace before Japan's situation became completely hopeless. Others pushed for a final decisive battle, one massive engagement that would inflict such catastrophic losses on American forces that negotiations would become possible. But these debates occurred against the backdrop of intelligence reports documenting the material imbalance. Reports showing that American combat power wasn't just superior, it was accelerating. New American fighters were entering service, improved Corsairs with more powerful engines, late-model Hellcats with better performance, jets in development. Each generation of American aircraft was more capable than the last. Japan's newest fighters, the few that actually reached production in meaningful numbers, were barely competitive with American designs from 1943. The Kawanishi N-1K Shiden and the Nakajima Ki-84 were good aircraft, well-designed and effective in skilled hands, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. Only hundreds were produced when thousands were needed. The pilots trained to fly them averaged 100 hours of total flight time when American pilots arrived in combat with over 300 hours. The technological gap was widening, not closing. The strategic calculus by spring 1944 was brutally simple. Japan had perhaps 5,000 aircraft of all types remaining, most obsolete, many grounded for lack of fuel or spare parts. American forces approaching the Marianas could call on thousands of carrier aircraft plus land-based air power from captured island bases. The ratio wasn't just unfavorable, it was apocalyptic. Understanding why you were losing didn't provide solutions. Some problems, once you understand them fully, reveal themselves to be unsolvable with available resources. Japan faced exactly that situation throughout 1944 and into 1945. The Corsair's 11-to-1 kill ratio, achieved across tens of thousands of sorties and verified through careful analysis of combat records from both sides, represented more than the superiority of one aircraft design over another. It represented the outcome when industrial capacity, pilot training, tactical doctrine, and aircraft design all aligned toward a single goal, winning through material superiority and systematic attrition. The Zero had been designed for a short, decisive war where Japan's limited resources could produce enough quality fighters to achieve air superiority during a brief window. The Corsair was designed for a long, grinding conflict where industrial might and pilot survivability would ultimately determine victory. Both aircraft served their nation's strategic visions perfectly. The tragedy for Japan was that their strategic vision had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. They had started a war they couldn't win against an enemy whose industrial capacity they had catastrophically underestimated. The Corsair over Rabaul was simply the physical manifestation of that miscalculation, translated into burning Zeros falling from Pacific skies. The legacy of the Rabaul campaign extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. The neutralization of the fortress without needing to capture it validated the strategy of bypass and isolation that would characterize American operations throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Strong Japanese positions could be isolated, their supply lines cut, their air power destroyed through sustained attack, leaving garrisons to wither on the vine, while Allied forces advanced past them toward Japan itself. This strategy saved countless American lives by avoiding costly direct assaults while still neutralizing enemy positions. The Corsair continued operations throughout the war, eventually becoming fully carrier qualified and operating from both land bases and carriers. By war's end, F4U pilots had claimed over 2,100 air combat victories against 189 losses to enemy aircraft, an overall kill ratio exceeding 11-to-1. Against the Zero specifically, the ratio climbed to approximately 12-to-1. These numbers made the Corsair the most successful naval fighter of World War II in terms of kill ratio, though the Hellcat achieved more total victories due to broader deployment. The aircraft remained in production until 1952, seeing combat in Korea where it served primarily in the ground attack role. Over 12,000 Corsairs were built in various models, one of the longest production runs of any American military aircraft. The distinctive bent-wing silhouette became iconic, representing American naval aviation to generations who studied the Pacific War. But the true significance of the Corsair's success lies in what it revealed about how wars are won. The Japanese pilots who faced Corsairs over Rabaul weren't inferior warriors. They were skilled professionals doing their best with the tools their nation could provide. But skill alone couldn't overcome the fundamental material disadvantages Japanese aviation faced. American pilots didn't need to be brilliant. They needed to be adequately trained and equipped with aircraft that translated industrial capacity into combat effectiveness. The Corsair provided exactly that. The Japanese engineers who analyzed Corsair wreckage and performance data understood what they were seeing. They recognized superior solutions to problems their own industry struggled with. They documented the lessons thoroughly, but recognition alone couldn't bridge the gap between understanding and implementation. By 1944, Japan lacked the materials, the manufacturing capacity, the quality control systems, and the time to incorporate those lessons into aircraft that could compete. The industrial war had already been decided. There is a broader lesson here about technological competition in total war. Intelligence matters. Understanding enemy capabilities is crucial. But intelligence only provides value if you can act on what you learn. Japan captured examples of American equipment throughout the war. They analyzed it professionally. They understood why it was effective. And none of it mattered because they couldn't replicate the industrial systems that produced it. You cannot reverse engineer an economy. You cannot copy a supply chain. You cannot duplicate decades of manufacturing experience through study alone. The Corsair over Rabaul taught Japan what they already feared but had been hoping wasn't true. America's industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, would be overwhelming. Every raid demonstrated it. Every engagement confirmed it. Every loss Japan suffered was permanent, while American losses were temporary inconveniences. By February 1944, when Rabaul fell silent and its airfields stood empty, Japanese military planners knew the war was lost. The only questions remaining were how long until defeat became undeniable and how much suffering would occur before surrender. The fortress that was supposed to break the American advance had instead broken Japanese naval aviation. The carrier air groups fed into Rabaul's defense were destroyed, their pilots killed or captured, their aircraft reduced to wreckage scattered across Simpson Harbor's waters and Rabaul's volcanic soil. The few survivors carried back reports of an enemy who controlled the skies through sheer material superiority, who flew aircraft that seemed almost invulnerable to the weapons Japanese fighters carried, who could afford to lose aircraft and pilots because replacement pipelines ensured every loss was temporary. In war, sometimes understanding the problem is the cruelest knowledge of all. It forces you to watch defeat approaching with perfect clarity and no ability to prevent it. The Corsair gave Japanese aviation that understanding. Every engagement over Rabaul, every Zero that fell burning from the sky, every American fighter that absorbed dozens of hits and flew away intact reinforced the lesson. Material superiority matters. Industrial capacity matters. Pilot protection matters. All the fighting spirit in the world cannot overcome an enemy who produces better aircraft faster than you can destroy them and trains pilots more thoroughly than you can replace your losses. The skies over Rabaul in late 1943 and early 1944 witnessed the death of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The Corsair was the instrument of that death, but the cause was deeper. It was the collision between two incompatible visions of how to fight a modern war. Japan's vision of quality, overcoming quantity, of spirit, compensating for material disadvantage, of brilliant tactics, defeating brute force. America's vision of overwhelming industrial production, creating material superiority so pronounced that adequate tactics and reasonable pilot training would suffice. History rendered its verdict in the wreckage scattered across Rabaul's airfields and in the waters of Simpson Harbor. The vision that worked was the one backed by factories producing thousands of aircraft monthly, by training programs graduating hundreds of pilots weekly, by an industrial system that could absorb losses and continue offensive operations without pause. The vision that failed was the one that required perfection because it couldn't afford anything less, that demanded superhuman skill because its aircraft couldn't protect ordinary humans, that counted on spirit to compensate for machines that were simply outclassed. If you found this deep dive into the battle that broke Japanese naval aviation compelling, hit that like button and share this story with fellow history enthusiasts. Subscribe for more untold stories from World War II that changed the course of history.